Meet sailing yacht Avanti and her crew, Gerard and Jacqueline. We left Cape Town in December 2021 on our floating home, heading west on an adventure of a lifetime around the world. It's a boat job day, and that means everything is a mess. We have to get in there, so we had to clean out everything out there, and that means the rest of Avanti, including our bed, looks like a tool shop. The job has to finish by the end of the day.
One of the more serious service jobs that these Volvo Penta D2-50s require is to check the valve clearances, or the tappets as some people call them. So for that you need to remove this rocker cover, and this is done it's recommended to be done every 600 hours or every 4 years. The engine is about 2.5 years old now, and we've done just 700 hours, so we're in a better spot to do it now. Previously we weren't really in a location where I wanted to do a bit more than any minor maintenance on the engine. So the first step is to remove the rocker cover to get to the rockers, where you check the valve clearances and adjust them as necessary. So for this job you don't need a lot of tools. You only need to take off these 4 dome head nuts, and they need a 14 spanner, or you can use a socket. I don't have that much headroom between the engine and the deck, so 14 spanner for that. Then there's also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 10 or 6 mil screws, which you need a 10 mil spanner for. And the ones that sit right next to the heat exchanger or the coolant reservoir is quite tricky to get to, so you need quite a small socket, a 10 mil socket, to get in there. So normal spanner or ring spanner or flat spanner won't work there, and a normal bulkier socket like this also does not fit in there, so a small 10 socket would work. Then what you also need to do is you need to remove the air inlet or air filter cover, and that's just secured by a hose clamp, so just a flat screwdriver to remove this housing. And then there's also a little like a manifold that you need to remove with a 10 spanner. So you need to remove this because the air intake manifold is integral to the rocker cover and sits right next to the rockers. So let's get cracking. One thing you also need is the engine's manual to just get the valve clearance. So the valve clearance is 0.2 millimeters, and that's standard for the D250 and the D255. They are actually exactly the same engines. The D250 is just a newer version, and it's a little bit down rated in power, and the D275 is also the exact same sub-assembly, it's just got the turbo on. So D250, D255 is a carbon copy. The air intake filter is actually not just secured by this hose clamp, so you need to loosen this with a flat screwdriver. You also need, there's a little 10 or M6 or 10 mil or bolt that you need to loosen with a 10 mil spanner at the back close to where the air inlet filter is. So just take those 2 off, and this should slide off to the back.
Luckily you don't have a big beer belly, or you wouldn't get in there.
So the air filter box should just slide off. Just take care, there's a bit of a spacer just for the bolt that secures it. You can see, just wiggle it and it comes right off, and this is the air intake into the manifold. So I've started by removing these 4 dome nuts, and they are not very tight. They just loosely, just more than hand tightened, so they're not torqued very heavily. And there is a little washer that's fixed with the paint, so just make sure you take the washers off, so that if you lift the rocker cover, the washers aren't still on there and you might drop them into an oil passage. So I'm just going to use some long nose pliers to take the 4 washers off the dome nuts. In total you have to remove 4 dome nuts, including their washers, as well as 4 M6 bolts and 1 M6 nut. With this, the rocker cover should just slide off. If it's a little bit stuck, you can just give it a tap with a rubber mallet, but just to break the seal, there's just an O-ring seal, an oil seal, so it just should just come off. Here you can see the cover that was removed. That's just the oil cap, the filler cap. This is actually the crankcase breather, so you don't have to take it off. I'll just flip it over. So you'll see the crankcase breather is just the port between the crankcase or the oil area and the inlet air area. So if there's excessive blow by the pistons, it will go in there. And you'll have a lot of soot build up over here where there's some oil passing through to the air intake, which in our case it's still quite clean, nice and clean, and it's because the engine is relatively new. And then you can see the seal you don't have to replace. It's a very weird shaped O-ring. I did buy a spare just for in case the O-ring was not in good shape or I damaged it while removing. So this O-ring should just seal, and it's not a very high pressure oil inside here. It's just to keep the oil from leaking and the air from leaking in. So the O-ring still looks pretty good. I'll just oil it up a little bit before I put it back. But yeah, that's the rocker cover that's come off. Quite easy so far. It's very important, these 4 ports, because it's a 4-cylinder, each cylinder has an air inlet port. And it's important to remember that these ports go directly into the piston. So if you drop a little screw or a washer down here and it actually goes into the piston, you will have big issues, because then you will not be able to get that out and it might damage the engine when you start it up. So it's probably a good idea just to cover this area. I'm just going to put an old rag across here so that you don't put any tools or any small parts in the cylinders. In order to check the valve clearances, you need to rotate the engine by hand so that the pistons go to top dead center, where the inlet and the outlet valve is closed, and the rocker is basically not under pressure. But so the first thing is you need to be able to rotate the engine. So you can do it by putting a big socket on this nut on the crank pulley, but I don't have such a big socket on board. I don't carry such big socket sizes. So these, you can also use these 3 holes in the crank pulley. What I've done is I've just taped up a 10mm bolt with a little bit of insulation tape. So it just goes, it sits in freely there. It's not the correct size, but I just screw it in with the tape just to make it go in secure. And I just use 2 of these. So the tape just protects the thread that's inside the actual pulley. And then I just use a socket handle just to put it in between the 2. And then you can rotate the engine slowly with not a lot of effort to check that you get to top dead center on the valve that you want to check. The tool we need to check the valve clearances is these thickness or feeler gauges. What this is just stainless steel fingers, each with a different thickness, and it's a precise thickness. So you can see on this one, for instance, it's marked 0.2 millimeters. That's our required valve clearance. So you just take this feeler gauge and you stick it in between the tappet and the rocker to check the gap. I'm going to show that now. On a 4-cylinder 8-valve engine, I'm not sure if it's valid for all 4 cylinders. There's a relatively easy like a method to check these valves to make sure that the valve you're checking is definitely fully closed. They call it the rule of 9. So what you do is you turn the engine until you can start wherever you want to, but I like to start at 1, until the number 1 or the number 1 or the piston number 1 inlet valve is fully open. So this you see by turning the engine, and this rocker will be in the fully down position. In other words, it's not loose and it's pushing the valve stem down into the open position. So I've turned it now, and it's just about, you might be able to see it, but it's still moving down a little bit, and there it's all the way down. So when the number 1 valve is open, fully open or down, or the rocker is down, you would take the number 1 plus the number that would sum to number 9. So if you're checking if number 1 valve is opening, you need 8 to complete the 9. So then you can check valve 8 should be loose. Like you can see, the rocker is loose, and you can check that with the feeler gauge, and you continue through the engine cylinders with that same rule. So if you check the number 2 valve or the cylinder 1 exhaust valve, if that is fully down, the number 2, you need to add 7 to get to 9. So then it means you can check the number 7 valve, and it works easy. The valves are numbered from the front. The number 1 piston has valve number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So if you use the rule of 9, the valve that opens plus whatever number you need to get to 9, you can check the valve clearance. So I'm going to start now by checking valve clearance on valve number 1. You can see the rocker is loose, so the valve is completely closed, and we've done that by checking that valve number 8 is completely open. So if you have valve number 8 completely open, you add 1 to get to 9, and you can check valve number 1 by using the rule of 9. You can see the feeler gauge really struggles to go in there. Means the valve is a little bit tight, or the valve clearance is too little. So to adjust it, there's a little adjustment screw on the other side of the rocker, and it's got a lock nut. So again, it's a 10 spanner that you would put on the nut. Try and keep the screwdriver in place, and you would loosen the lock nut anti-clockwise just a little bit, and then you can turn the adjustment screw. So if you tighten the adjustment screw, it will make the valve clearance less. So we need to make the valve clearance more, so we're turning the adjustment screw anti-clockwise to loosen it. Okay. I've done it a little bit too much. I'm just using the feeler gauge now, tightening it up. Slides in too freely still, so just a little bit more. Too tight. It's very fine. So you want the feeler gauge to slide in just slightly. There you go. So it's sliding nice and tight now. And what you do is you keep the adjustment screw in place as tight as you can, and then you tighten the lock nut again. So keep the adjustment screw in place, tighten the lock nut, and before you tighten it fully, just check the clearance again. You can see it slides in not too freely, and it's still loose. So what I do is just to make sure I haven't made it too loose, I would just take the next feeler gauge size up and see if that doesn't go in there, just to make sure it's not too loose. The next size up is 0.23 millimeters, so 0.03 millimeters more than the required size. And you can see there, it's just not going in. So this one should be set. Just going to tighten the lock nut completely. There you go. And yeah, so number one should be done. We've worked through all 8 valves, and 4 of the valves were a little bit too tight, so we had to just loosen them up, and the other 4 didn't need adjustment at all. So yeah, I'll just check them one final time again. After completing all the valve clearance checks, we just have to pop this cover back on. I've put this air inlet nozzle back on. I broke the gasket. There was a little graphite gasket, so I've put some gasket maker, high temperature gasket maker on there. And I've just put a little film of oil onto the O-ring that should seal any air from leaking in or oil from leaking out. So you can just pop this on and retighten the bolts as they came off. Everything is covered up. We haven't actually run the engine, I think, now in a month since we've been here in Indo, relatively stationary. So yeah, only thing that's left is to start it and just to listen how it runs. Hopefully there's no massive knocking noises. Today was super busy and probably not the best day to tackle the valve clearance checks because there was almost no wind, so I probably lost like 2 liters of fluids just sweating while working on the engine. Luckily you set the valve clearances when the engine is cold and not hot, so it's time to try a beer. We found this one in a supermarket here in Lombok, and it's actually, they say it's brewed in barley. It's kind of a craft beer, so the name is Kura Kura. They've got a few variations. This one is called an Island Ale, and it comes in a 330 ml bottle, well, not bottle, can, and it's got 4.9% alcohol in. So let's see how this one goes. As you can see, the color is quite light. It's a little bit hazy, so not as clear as the lagers we used to, and it's got quite a bit of a head. So yeah, let's see how this one goes down. It's really nice and fruity, not like an overpowering like a pear taste, but more just a subtle fruity taste. So really nice and refreshing, and really much better than the lagers. So really nice to have some other options that we finally found, and these are actually brewed in Bali, not in Jakarta or Java like the rest of the beers. So I'd be keen to actually go to the brewery in Bali when we do go to Bali. In terms of the costs in the supermarket, these are not as cheap as the bintangs. So these are about just under the 50,000 Indonesian rupee. So the cost is a bit of a downside, so definitely not as cheap as the Bintangs. But in terms of taste, size and cost, I would rate this one a refreshing 8.5 out of 10. Cheers.
Thank you for watching this more technical video. Next episode, we take a break from jobs and go on a road trip and find some unexpected gems. If you like this week's video, please remember to give it a like. And we're looking forward to any and all questions you might have in the comments. A special thank you to our Patreons. See you in 2 weeks.